Hi, my name is Bob Bourke. On the video you're about to see, we're going to try to teach you as much as we can in the next couple hours about small engines. We're going to present you with something that you can find in manuals like this, but we're going to try to show it to you so it becomes a little more real to you. We're going to approach this job in a way that anybody can understand. We're not going to use a lot of fancy tools or a lot of fancy procedures, because basically we're hoping that you, out there, will be able to do all these jobs when we're done. The two engines we're going to work on simultaneously are both Briggs & Stratton engines. Now, Briggs & Stratton is an American manufacturer, and a lot of the principles that we'll work on in these things are the same through most engines. But in engines from about 3 to 8 horsepower, Briggs & Stratton supplies about 75% of original equipment engines, so we've selected these two to work on. This one here is a 3 horsepower Briggs & Stratton engine. It's a vertical shaft engine, and that means it sits like this. This is the engine you probably have on your lawnmower, all right? An upright pull start, a vertical shaft out the bottom where your blade goes, and you've probably got this or a very close brother to it on your lawnmower. This one here is an 8 horsepower engine, and it's a horizontal crankshaft, and this one is off a water pump. And these are used in applications like rotor tillers, water pumps as I mentioned, and in many, many varieties of things. I had one on a go-kart when I was a kid. The reason we selected these two engines is that you're going to find most of the principles we talk about on this video, from this engine to this, are common up to about 8 horsepower. Briggs makes this engine from 3 horsepower through to 6, and they make this horizontal shaft engine through from 3 horsepower right up to 16. But there's a lot of common principles here, although we have some slight differences. Now we're going to break this video into some different segments. First of all, we're going to do recoil starters. Because this is where the whole thing starts, we have to be able to get the engine running. And on this video, we'll take these recoil starters off, compare the differences, disassemble them and put them aside. We'll move on to carburation, because we have two different basic carburation systems here. We have a flow jet carburetor here on this engine, and this little lawnmower engine has what Briggs calls a pulsa-jet carburetor system. We'll take them apart and show you how to install a kit in them, disassemble them and put them back together and adjust them. Thirdly, we'll move to ignition systems. And both of these engines have a basic system that's very similar, although they're in slightly different places on the machine. We'll work on ignition systems. Next, we will move into engine overhaul. We're going to actually open both of these engines up, take out the pistons, the valves, the connecting rods, and the crankshafts and so on, show you how all that stuff goes together so that you can do a complete engine overhaul. Lastly, we're going to have a little area on troubleshooting and tuning. We'll reassemble both of these engines right here, start them up, and show you how to tune them in. Let's get started. We're going to do both these simultaneously, so we'll move the big one out of the way for now, and we're going to start on this little one. I'm going to move it up here in the vise, and we're going to remove the starter from it. Now you'll find some slight variations on this starter on most Briggs or most lawnmower engines, and this holds true for other makes as well. This is very similar to a Tecumseh starter, very similar to a Kawasaki or Honda starter. And we're going to use this Briggs because, as I said, they are the single most popular engine in North America. All the tools that we use on this video are simple hand tools, and I may use something like this that you don't have, but you can easily do this with an open end or box end wrench. 3 little bolts basically to take this housing off. Oop. All right. 3 bolts. One there in the front, one around behind in this side, which I won't even show you because this is so simple. One little note right here. We have an oil filler up here, and this has a little strap over it. I've removed that bolt to save us some time, and I have drained the oil out of this engine. So I'm just going to pull this filler plug out of here, or filler stick out of here, and set it aside for now. One more little bolt right in there. Let's get it off. I'm going to lose my engine if I'm not careful here. But these are very simple things. 3 little bolts to hold that cowling on. Let me tighten this up a little. Now let's lift that off. Now basically that's just a housing, because our recoil starter on this model is around on this side. And I'm going to turn that around so you can see it. Now this is a vertical pull recoil starter, and we chose this engine to show you because this vertical pull is slightly different than just the rotary pull that we have on our 8 horsepower, and we'll show you that in a minute. This little piece here, this little housing with the spool in it, is held by 2 bolts. I've removed that one. We're going to go in and take that one out inside. If your engine is dirty, like mine is, you'll have to look to find that bolt, but it's right in there. 1/2 inch head on it. You'll need a socket of some kind for this and an extension to go in and take that off. Now that bolt also secures the gas tank. So we have to go in and take that bolt right out and slide this piece out this way. Let's do that. Pull that bolt, set it aside, and we'll take this little starter housing out this way. I'm going to turn that over and show it to you now. As I said, when we have everything disassembled and put it all back together, we'll show you how to fix each and every of these components. All right, but that's the little recoil starter off the vertical pull model. Let's set that aside. Now I don't want to mix up my parts here because that's very important, but one thing I'll point out before we move on to our next engine, this little place in the flywheel here, these little gears engage with that starter. All right, I'll just bring that back for a second. These engage with that little spool there, and that's what starts your engine and makes this turn. When you pull this, this piece lifts up, the little gear there lifts up, engages with that, and turns your crankshaft. I'm going to set this aside and bring our 8-horse over here, and we'll take the starter off of it. Set that down there. I want to keep my bolts separately because I'm doing 2 of these at once, and hopefully you won't attempt that right away. This is our 8-horsepower engine. Again, we have a basic cowling that's very similar to the one we just took off, except of course much bigger. But on this one, we have a rotary spool starter in here that pulls this way. Let's take it off. Let's get the right size of socket. Let's take that starter housing off. As I say, we will completely rebuild these. Later in this tape, in this video, we'll completely rebuild those and disassemble them and show you how to get that wicked spring back in there. I've got one bolt down underneath here. I've got to set that engine just off the edge of the table, but you can find these very easily. These are no problem to change. Now, we're using actual engines that have come from the field here. In a lot of video presentations you'll see like this, you'll see people working on brand new engines, but you basically don't get to see the real problems that we encounter doing engines out of the field. This one has had the recoil starter housing replaced once, as you can see, and the grease on there is original equipment. That's the way this engine come into my shop, and that's the way we're going to repair it. 4 little bolts off, and we just yank this housing right off, like that. Now there's 2 components here that work on the recoil starter in this engine. In here you can see we have a nylon spool in here, and this is where our rope runs. All right. Now this part of the starter is what retracts the rope backwards. All right. And this is where the terrible, wicked little spring that you may have had problem with sits, right underneath this. All right. We're going to set that aside for a minute. I want to show you one other component of the starting system, and that's right here. This is a little sprag clutch. It's a one-way clutch, and when it turns that way, it holds. When it turns this way, it freewheels. Now what happens on this starting system, when you pull a rope, you basically lock this little clutch, like that. Your engine is rotated this way to start, and once your engine starts, this thing sits stationary, and your engine turns without it. All right, just like that. Your engine's turning over, but this piece sits stationary. I'll show you why as we go inside. We have 4 little nuts there. We're going to take off, if I can find the right wrench. These are 1/4 inch. Let's just take them off, and we'll disassemble the rest of our recoil starter in this 8-horse. 4 little screws. Two. And 3. 2 and 3. Try to do this in a clean area. If you're doing this outside, you may lose little components like this. So try to lay down a sheet of something or do this on cement. This is a screen, and in this engine, all this does is protect this engine from drawing too much foreign material in here, because these engines breathe through this area. They draw air in here, and it's fanned up and through the engine. So this screen is just to protect from foreign material, but you should never run a Briggs engine without this, or any small engine, because they'll draw in grass clippings or straw or anything and pack in here and overheat your engine. Let's take the screen off. There's the little clutch I talked about, and we're going to disassemble it right now, although it serves two purposes on this engine. It secures the flywheel to the engine, but it also contains those little balls that make it work as a clutch. Now Briggs & Stratton has a special tool for this, and I'm going to show this to you. This is a removal tool for taking off this nut, and I'm going to just show you how they work on there, but you're not going to want to buy these because they're about $50 a set. And there's another way to do it, but let me just point out to you how this is done with this tool. This part right here snaps on, or goes on to any two. Let me set this out over the edge a little. This sets on to any two of these things, okay, or any one or two, however many you can grab, because this little tool fits all models. That goes on like that, and then this is the wrench that we use for this. All right, it fits over there in one of these positions or whatever. Okay, well there's one position where this is going to work. Oh, anyway, the way we're going to take this off, we need a hammer and a punch. Now what we have to know about this is that this is a little threaded piece, and it's got threads inside of it just like a nut. And it unscrews just like a nut off the end of the crankshaft. So how we're going to unscrew that is we're going to place a punch right here on this little ear, and we're going to strike this right here. And we're going to try to start that thing loosening until we can get it loose enough to take it off by hand. Just watch. All right, let's do it again. Just watch right there. And we're going to try to make this piece move without moving the flywheel. Did we move it? Let's try it again. Oh, let's roll that back to where we want it. We've got to keep that little piece together because there's something very important we have to show you about that. All right, let's tap it again. Let's see if we're getting that loose. Yes, we are. Okay, we've hammer loosened that and taken that off without $50 worth of specialized tools. One thing I want to point out right now, when you are loosening this, you can see there's big tabs here and a little tab there. Use the big tabs for hammering. Use the big tabs for striking, because if you have to hit these small ones too many times, you'll collapse that little bolt hole. You'll have trouble getting your screw back in. Let's unscrew that. Nothing to it. Now you can hear a little jingling in there. And that's because this starter component is full of little balls. And when we reassemble, we'll show you that. Let's take it off of here. There's a little shaft it sits on. And right in here is a very important little washer. And that's a beveled washer. And we'll talk about that when we're reassembling. Let's set that aside. Now that we've got those pieces apart, we want to move on to carburation. And I'm going to bring back our little engine to do that. Now, as part of talking about carburation, we're going to talk about fuel systems. And there's a couple basic differences in how these two work. This system is a pulse-eject system. This is your gas tank. Your carburetor is mounted immediately on top of that, and immediately on top of that is your air cleaner. Let's just disassemble this first. This is the air cleaner off most of these small engines are like this. This one, incidentally, is on backwards. All right? It should be turned this way. And the reason is that Briggs has cut a corner off to let you put fuel into your tank easier. That's the air cleaner off that. It's a little foam cleaner. We'll just take it off and set it aside. This is your pulse-eject carburetor in here, and it works on a basic principle. And as we disassemble, you'll see what's happening here. Now we've got 3 bolts along the front of the engine, on top of the head, that secure a little plate here, and this secures to the carburetor, and I've removed that bolt there so we can take this off a little more easily. We have one other component to worry about, and one other thing that we have to watch when we take this apart. I'm going to turn this like this. We have a little tube right here, And this is a crankcase tube that actually creates suction to make this carburetor operate. We're going to slide this away like this. And all that's going to be left holding on here is a linkage. And you can see that that's a little link that hooks onto this, which is your throttle, and this, which is your governor vane. Now this little bar here has just a little step down in it, and to get loose from the rest of this carburetor, we just have to go out, tip it like that, and off it comes. You can see that there's just a little hook in the end, and that goes into a little wee hole right in this dirty thing. Now, this little tube, as I say, fits this rubber component. Right here you'll notice a tube, and that goes on this air horn in this carburetor, and there's an O-ring in there. So be careful, Everett, when you're reassembling, that we have that O-ring clean and get it back in place. We're going to set this aside for now because we've done all we can do on that, and I'm going to take that carburetor out of the gas tank. All right, the Pulsajet carburetor. As I mentioned, this is quite a bit different from the one on the other engine, and we'll have a look at them both as we go along. If you set this tank in a vise, do it very gingerly because these tanks are made out of zinc or sometimes aluminum. They won't stand a whole lot of pressure. This little carburetor sits on here and is basically self-contained. Everything that has to be done is done in here with suction again supplied from the valve housing, as I said, on this little tube. Your tube that feeds your fuel and air mixture into your engine is that one where I mentioned the O-ring. This screw adjustment here is basically a needle valve, and that controls your high speed. Now what we're going to do is just disassemble this and lift it off the gas tank. We have 4 little screws or 5 little screws in these, depending on the models. One there. One here. One over here. That's a tough one. You'll sometimes find these screws damaged or in bad shape, and that's usually because they've been loose and vibrated and worn out the threads. We've got 2 in behind here. There's nothing complicated about it, so I'm not going to turn it to show. I'm not going to turn the carburetor around to show it to you. All right, 5 screws. Let's take them out and lay them on the bench or in a safe place. Don't lose these. They're special screws. I'll lay one here so you can take a close-up look at it. They're a special screw because they have a funny little end on them. They don't want to lay still. You can see that. They have a funny little end, and that's to start and to make it a perfect alignment when you screw them into this gas tank. All right, let's get rid of that. Now we're going to pop this carburetor directly off the tank. We can do that just by tapping it a couple times. And down in here we have the heart of this carburation system. And that's a pickup tube you see right here, which goes down and sits in gasoline. It's got a little screen on it to filter out impurities, and that draws gas up here. And this little spring we'll talk about some more because we're going to put a new carb kit into here. If you put a carb kit in this engine, this is the carb kit. This little rubber piece with this spring attached to it, and there's a little rod that goes up that we'll show you in a minute. We'll set that aside, take this out of the vise, and carefully stack all this stuff together. Big engine time again. Let's set that down there. The big engine, as I said, has flow jet carburation, and this is a slightly different concept. This has a carburetor here with a bowl. It's got a big air cleaner up this way, and it's got the gas tank mounted on the far side. Now this is more like a conventional automotive system, except that this tank on this engine is gravity feed. All right? We have to supply gas to this carburetor. It will not lift its own gas or suck its own gas like the Pulsajet system does. Let's start right back here at the beginning. The fuel tank. Underneath we have a little shut-off valve. All right, to turn the gas off if we want to do any service on the far side. If we're storing this engine over winter, it's a good idea to turn this off in case anything in your carburetor starts leaking. So we'll turn it off right now, and we're going to remove that tank first of all to get it out of the way. We'll have a little clamp down here of some kind, On some of the older models, you may have a sediment bowl down here. All right, but let's take this little line off. Best way to take these small lines off is to grab them with the pliers first and give them a twist just to loosen them up. And I'm going to work this off here with the pliers. This is a little hard on hoses if your hoses are old or brittle. We'll just take this off and push it back out of the way. Now to take the fuel tank off this engine, we have two bolts right straight in underneath here, which you're not going to be able to see, but there's nothing to them, just two simple bolts. I'm going to remove them, and then we'll take the two bolts off up top. They say nothing fancy and nothing complicated about this. We're going to take it off for convenience to get it out of the way. Now some of you may be lucky, you may have a small shop and a compressor, and a lot of these jobs are much more easily done with air. But we're going to do this by hand for those of you who don't have those air tools. Two there. Spin this way and you can see two bolts up top. Let's snap them loose. Well, on second thought, there's a proper tool for every job, and I guess this might be more like the proper one. These two bolts also double as head bolts, so we're going to have to remove them sooner or later, so we'll take them out right now. Now these bolts on this particular engine are extra length. And what I would suggest we do now is keep these two bolts separate or else mark them. What you can do is go to one of your kids and say, let me borrow your yellow crayon. Which I should have done. There we go. And mark these two like this. Put a little crayon mark on them and put that same mark on your tank. A couple little marks, and you'll know where those two bolts came from. If we have to go to another color, we'll have to borrow a different crayon. There's the fuel tank. It's off and free. As I can say, you can have a good look at that little valve on the bottom. Not much to that. Let's take this. Let's put these two bolts back in here like this. And that'll, when we stack this in the corner, we'll have everything together. We'll set that down. That's the first part of our fuel system. Okay, it comes around this side. Right here we have a little filter, an inline filter, and that filter looks like something you maybe have never seen before. That's an original Equipment Briggs & Stratton filter. You can replace that with a long gas line filter with no problem. The only thing you have to do in this engine is make sure wherever you hang it, you're clear of your accessories or pulleys or anything else. Let's turn around to here, and here's our carburetor. Now we're going to remove our air cleaner right now. And you remember on our small engine, we had a small foam air cleaner. This is a bigger engine, and we've got a big foam air cleaner, except this is not a foam air cleaner. This is an outer sock, and you'll find this on some of these engines and some you won't. This is a big outer sock that fits over a paper filter. This is an excellent idea for engines running in dirty conditions because you can take this out and wash it out and put it back on and preserve the $12 filter by getting the $1.95 one dirty. Let's set it aside. We have another wing nut down here. And we have something here, as I say in our videos that we're doing here, you're seeing stuff the way it comes from the field. This is an air cleaner that should have never been run because it's been crushed and collapsed, and it's almost a certainty it's leaking dirt. Let's unscrew that. Wing nut there. And let's lift that straight off. All right, there's the base, our filter base. And we're getting down closer to our carburetor. Now we have another air horn here that brings the fuel around. We're going to disassemble that right now. We got a screw down here, for which I got the wrong screwdriver. We have a Phillips screw right here. We'll take off. And let's turn this around, and you'll see right down here we have a little strap that runs across the bottom from there to there. And this rod here is hooked onto that little strap. So we have to remove this little bolt here so that we can take this component off. Let's do that. as soon as we find the right wrench. There we are. Okay, let's go down here and take this little bolt out of here. And that will let this assembly come off and this whole air horn loose. Now you'll see on a Briggs engine, if you have a flooding problem, that this is where they'll drip fuel. Fuel will flood in here and it'll run down here and it'll usually drip out here. And if you've got that dripping, it means your needle and seat is stuck in here and your engine is probably flooding. Let's remove that. Straight down. Let's put that aside. Now we're going to wiggle this little air horn and take it off, but there's one other thing we want to look at around this side, and that's a crankcase ventilation tube. And this comes from the valve cover. Yes, this has a valve cover just like your big engine. Comes to here, and this goes back into here, so the fumes that come from your engine are inhaled back into the intake tube and go down and are reburned. This is a molded tube, and there's nothing else you can use for that but to go to your Briggs dealer and pick one up. They're not very expensive, but nothing else will fit. So let's just slip that off for now. Let's wiggle this air horn and take it off. Again, we have another O-ring seal right here. This particular one is made out of plastic, but you'll find these in plastic, aluminum, zinc, and cast iron. Let's take that O-ring off and get it out of the way. We'll put it with this air horn and set it aside. Now we come to our carburetor, a flow jet carburetor, as I said, and it's secured on here with two bolts. And there's one straight down here, and the one we just took out that holds the air cleaner on that serves a common purpose. I'm going to see if I can get down here with my screwdriver, which I can, so I'll get a smaller one, and take that other screw out. Right there. And that's going to let our carburetor come free, if I can get it off. All right, I'm going to let our carburetor drop down here and show you how to disconnect our linkage. Little tap here because this gasket may be stuck. There, our carburetor's loose, and we can finish taking that screw out. All right, there's our carburetor loose. Now we're hanging up on a couple things in here, and I want to get a shot in here if we can and show you what's holding us up. We have a rod up here from here to here, and we have a gasket hanging here. Let's throw that away. We're going to be replacing that. There's a little rod that runs up from here to here, and on this engine your throttle will be hooked to a little lever down in here, and this controls your throttle on that carburetor. It's like our small engine. It has a little kink in the end, so to get this carburetor off, we just have to bring it back. Don't bend this and don't force it. Tip the carburetor, and off we come. That's our flow jet carburetor. It has a single adjustment right here. That's your idle speed, and it has an adjustment in here, okay, which I've taken out, which is your high speed jet, and we'll show you how to put a carb kit in this one and tune it back in when we're reassembling. Let's set it aside. This air horn here is part of the carburation system, but I'm not going to show you taking that off because that's so simple. We'll take that off, and one thing I want to mention here is that we have to be very careful about the gaskets in here and here, because if either one of them leak air, what this engine does is lift the fuel from the carburetor that sat here, and it has to be able to suck it up and over and into the engine. And it does that just from the suction of the piston going down, the intake valve being open, it lifts the fuel air mixture over here. If we have a leak here or a leak here, it draws air and won't draw that gas up. I'm going to set that aside because you don't have to see me take that off. That's the carburation system on our big one. We'll put that engine away for a minute. How about a brake?
Go ahead.
We're back to our small engine now. Now we're going to move on to ignition because we've got both our carburetors off, but right now I think we'll just knock this muffler off to get it out of the way. Now in these small Briggs engines you'll find a variety of mufflers. I don't know how many hundred variations they made, but this is one of them. You'll find this on the bigger, more expensive mowers. This is the fancy model muffler for the quiet neighborhood. I took one bolt out already. These are the only one I want to show you. I want to make a note of. They've got little retainers. We just got to put a screwdriver in there and flatten that little retainer out. Now if you've got a really rusty one, you'll have to watch because that retainer might be melted right into the bolt. But watch for that retainer because you won't be able to get a socket on and you'll be wondering. You'll be cursing the metric system and it'll be just because that retainer's in there and you haven't seen it. Just knock that back. I'm going to take that muffler off and I'm going to show you when we get underneath it something else about different variations of Briggs & Stratton mufflers. And this again applies to the small verticals. Most of the big engines, like our 8-horse over there, are threaded in, and we'll look at that before we get into ignition too. Nothing to this. These bolts are sometimes very tight and seized in, although they're not always because the engine is aluminum, the bolts are steel. But you have to be careful. Don't be careless. You won't be getting the biggest wrench out you've got right away to take these off. Let's slide that back and show you that. Now what you can see there is that this muffler has an insert right here that puts it in and lines it up, but that insert serves two purposes. On different models of engines, you'll have mufflers that are screwed directly into here. And if you can get a look at that, there's threads in there. All right, we have threads in there. And Briggs screws many of their mufflers in straight in with pipe thread. So this engine, that little sleeve serves the purpose of going in there and protecting these threads. And when that muffler burns out, we go to our dealer and he wants $25 for it, we can go back to the Briggs dealer and buy a little screw-in muffler for about $5 and screw it into there and use that for replacement. That's our muffler out of the way. Let's get into our ignition system. The system we have on these two engines is basically the same, but hidden in a slightly different place, and that's down under this flywheel. This little piece here is a piece of plastic, and I'm going to get it out of the way. It's a governor spring, or a governor vane. And just really briefly, as we're passing by, what happens in this engine is this flywheel turns, it creates air, and the faster it goes, the more air it creates, and it blows this vane out like this. So when this engine's running, this vane is blown out here like this, and that pulls the spring and slows your carburetor down. The more air that comes, the more it slows it back down. All right? Don't break this because it's very critical. If you don't have that in there, your engine will do about, well, it'll do as many RPMs as it can until it blows up. We're just going to get it out of the way, and we'll examine that in more detail when we put it back together. That's your governor spring, or governor vane, and the spring, we're just going to disconnect all that and set it down. Now, again, a screen. We mentioned on our big engine, we got 3 little bolts on this one, and that's just to protect this engine from grass clippings and so on. And we're going to get down into the nitty-gritty here, into the heart of this thing, and find our points and condenser, in the heart of our ignition system. Three little screws and a screen. Set them aside. And there's what anchors our flywheel. Now in this particular model, you remember we had the big combination nut that was part of the recoil starter on our big engine. On this one we just have this nut and the end of the crankshaft because our starter system, remember, works off the gear. We've got to put a socket on this, and I've got to find the right size. Looks like about one of them. Right on. Now you don't have to have a socket to do this. You can do this with an open-ended wrench. Again, we have the problem of anchoring this flywheel. Do not put things through this flywheel like this to hold it because they're aluminum. But you can grab your crankshaft out the bottom in a vise, tighten that up, and preferably put a little bit of light oil or penetrating oil on here. Mine's gone missing. Put a little bit of penetrating oil on here to loosen this up and take it off with a socket. All right, we're going to have to hold tight on our crankshaft. If you have an air wrench or an electric impact, this is the place to use it. There we go, we're loose. That one was pretty tight. And off comes that little nut. And right underneath that, we have that little beveled washer again. All right? We talked about that. It's the same as the one on the big engine. Set it aside. Now here we have a flywheel. And this is actually a combination flywheel and magnet. And the magnet is right here. That's a magnet built into an aluminum flywheel. And what happens is, as this flywheel turns, it goes by this little armature here, which also we'll look at in more detail. There's a little coil in here. It sets up an electrical impulse and comes down this high tension coil to fire your spark plug. And this happens every single time this goes around. We get a little pulse, bang, pulse, bang, pulse, bang. So that's how your ignition system works, except that that's controlled by breaker points, and they're underneath here. Now, one thing I have to point out to you right here, this flywheel is tapered. So to get it off, there's two ways to do it. And one is to have a puller, all right, made by many companies, that sit across here. And with two bolts down here, we can pull this off, snap. But we're going to show you the homegrown way to do it. What we're going to do is drive in two screwdrivers or chisels underneath this flywheel and tap this crankshaft on the head. And that's going to pop that off. Let's do that. Now you can use a screwdriver if it fits. On engines that don't have this gear drive starter mechanism, you may need to use a chisel because you may need something thicker. So let's tap that in there just to put a little bit of tension, a little lift on that flywheel. And I got to get one more screwdriver. Be very careful when you're going in here to do this that you watch and be careful where you drive these in because you can do some damage. And remember, we're not trying to drive them in to pop it off immediately. We're driving them in simply to put pressure on this flywheel, to put up pressure on this flywheel, and raise, take the end plate out of the crankshaft upward. We'll tap that in. Now, we want to hit this right on the kazoo here, on the head. But we want to use something soft. We don't want to hammer directly on that. We want to use a piece of brass or a piece of aluminum to do that because we don't want to damage this shaft. I've got an aluminum punch here. Use something made out of aluminum or brass. Wood won't do the job because it'll absorb the shock. We've got our screwdrivers tapped in. We're going to tap this. All right. You saved another $50 on tools with that little trick because you don't need that puller. We're going to lift this off. We'll show you that bore, and we'll show you the tapered crankshaft that I talked about. All right, and the tapered bore in the flywheel. Now, let's set that aside. One very important little component right here, before we move another inch or another minute on a repair job, I'm going to take this out and turn this so you can see this. Get a different angle and a different perspective on this. Is this little key right here. Now that's a little key made out of aluminum. And this is the single most common cause of ignition failure on a lawnmower engine. That's this little key here. I'm going to knock it out. It's aluminum. I'm going to knock it out right down there so you can see it. Now what that key does is it secures your flywheel to your crankshaft at an exact angle. You remember what I said about the magnet in this flywheel passing by this little armature? All right? This crank, or this key, makes sure the relation of the crankshaft, which controls your piston in here, makes sure that the relationship of that to when this engine fires is right. If you hit your water shutoff or a sidewalk or anything with your lawnmower, this aluminum key will shear partway through and effectively destroy your engine timing. So if you notice your mower doesn't run properly after you hit something, this key is the reason. Let's set it aside for a minute. Come on in, Rob. Just give us a 2-minute break, Joe. Now we're down to our point cover. All right, this covers our points and condenser. 2 more little 1/4-inch screws. Take them out and lay them aside. Now this is a little tin cover that covers your breaker points, and you'll find this in all Briggs engines except the very latest models, and they use what's called a magnetron ignition. So they don't have this component in here, but everything up until about 1982 does. We're going to pop this off, and it's sealed with a little piece of glue right down on this side that just covers the wire that comes into it. But we'll just take that, shake it loose, and take off our cover. Let's set that aside. Right in here we have our ignition points. All right? Now, just to go back, to backtrack a little bit, we mentioned that the magnet goes around here in the flywheel and goes by this armature. That armature sets up an electrical charge that comes through the spark plug wire. But what we have to do in an electrical field to make it fire is to collapse the field. We do that by grounding out this piece here, and when we ground that, it collapses the magnetic field and fires the spark plug. Now how we control that collapse, all right? The magnet sets up the electricity in here, but how we control the collapse of that field is we have these points closed, and that grounds this. So the ignition points located right in here are hooked onto 2 little wires. I'll spin this right around and maybe we can get a look at it. There's 2 little wires come off of this armature. I can set this in here. There we go. There's 2 little wires that come off this armature. Or pardon me, 1 little wire. There's 2 wires coming out of the points. 1 little wire here, and this goes around to the other side. And this is a kill wire. This will shut our engine off. So when you put your throttle down on your lawnmower, it actually grounds out this wire, shorts the points out, and then all the spark is dead forever. The other little wire that goes into here hooks to your breaker points, and that's hooked to this armature, and that's what causes, when the points close and ground out, it collapses this field and causes the engine to fire. We're going to leave that stuff alone for now. We'll show you how to install on our way back. Now, I'm going to set this aside for a minute and show you just roughly the same thing in the big engine, but we won't go into it in any more depth than what we have to. Let's set this aside. Bring up big engine again. Big engine, 8 horsepower. Big flywheel again. We're going to use the same method to remove that flywheel that we did on this other one, and it has the exact same key. Now this type of crankshaft is even more critical that we don't hit the end of it with a hammer, and that's because of the recoil starter action of that little spool sitting on here. But I'm going to remove this flywheel in exactly the same way by wedging 2 screwdrivers or 2 chisels from either side, using an aluminum punch, whacking it there, and driving it off. The points in this engine are identical to the points in the little one that we took apart. So we're not going to do that right now, but they're identical. They have the same cover, the same adjustments and everything. Here's a little better look at this armature. Now you'll find on Briggs engines, you'll find mostly 2-leg armatures. This is a 2-leg armature. And on the occasional one, you'll find a 3-legged armature. And don't ask me why. I guess it's something to do with evolution. But some have 3 legs, but most of them have 2. And you can see again that wire going up there. And the kill wire on this engine that comes out from the points is this one right here. And it runs down again to the throttle linkage. You don't have to see us take that apart, so we're just going to set that aside for now and keep moving into that little engine. Back to the little fella. All right, we've showed you our gasoline system, our fuel delivery system, and our carburation. We've identified where all that is. We've gone through our starter system and we've gotten into our ignition system. We've got our mufflers out of the way. What we're going to do right now is get into the guts of the system. And what we're going to do is remove this armature nut. You don't need to see us do that because this stuff is all just screwed together. we're going to strip this engine down right now, and we're going to take off we'll show you how to take off the bottom end, basically what's the oil pan on this engine, and we're going to have a look inside of it. Let's turn this engine over. Now what we have up here on the top side, and I want to anchor this very gently here. We have to be careful with these little engines because they're aluminum. As we said, you have to be very careful with them. This is a lawnmower hub. This is the hub that your blade fits onto, and we have to pull that off. Now basically, again, we should have a small puller to do that, but I believe we can get it off by tapping it here. But I've believed in strange things before too. Let's try a couple hammers, the old synchronized tap here. It's not quite as pretty as synchronized swimming, but it's moving. Let's just tap this up. Okay. Believe me, it's coming. Okay, just tap that up. Give it a turn, tap it up some more. And it's coming off. We've got to tap a little bit on each side. Yeah, we're just about there. This is where we go to edit, folks, because we're going to have to pull it.
Go ahead.
There we are. That was really rusty. You can see there's a little key in there too, but that's no relation to the key we looked at up top earlier on. Now if you have a real extreme case, you may have to pull that, but I've seen very, very few over the years that you've had to pull. Usually that'll come off with your mower blade when you take your blade off. Let's get that key out of there. A side cutter right here, little Woodruff key. Take it off. That's a half moon key if you can get a shot of that. Whoop. Where'd it go? Okay, we'll find it. It went down the hole in the center. That's where my half moon key went. We don't need to look at it anyway. We're going to take the oil pan off this engine. And the oil pan is right here. Take a look. This bottom housing is the oil pan. We've got a bolt here, 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 and here. And it's aluminum. And in the center we've got a little seal. And we're going to show you how to replace that because quite often if you get twine wrapped up in your lawnmower blade, it'll destroy that seal and all your oil will run out the bottom of your engine all the time you're mowing your lawn. Let's set it right there. I'm going to snug up on this a little bit. Be careful, like I said, where you grab these things because they're all aluminum. Now, tools all over the place. Let's take this oil pan apart. Now, one other thing that I'm going to mention to you right now, just while I'm loosening these off, is Briggs & Stratton makes different qualities of engine. And these are specified by the original equipment manufacturers. They might say, Mr. Briggs and Mr. Stratton, we want the best you can supply, or we want a durable one, or we want one for a certain reason. And some of the differences in those engines that are right behind in this point, on this engine, we just have a bushing. Now this crankshaft comes straight through the aluminum housing, and it just rides in the aluminum housing. But in some of the fancier models, or engines that have a need, they'll put a ball bearing in here, all right, to carry this crankshaft. And they'll do that in a situation where they're side loading the crankshaft heavily, pulling on it heavily because of a belt or chain drive. You'll have a ball bearing in here. But because this engine shaft comes straight down and the pressure on it is equal because of the lawnmower blade, it just has a bushing. Now the reason I brought this up is that in small engines, 3 through 8 horsepower, that have a light duty side plate in them, which is this plate, although it's a bottom on the mower, sometimes if this engine is run out of oil, it will seize that side bushing. And this plate will actually seize to your crankshaft right here. Now something else that I want to tell you is that a lot of times if you have a seized up small engine, you don't necessarily have a seized rod bearing. You may have this side plate seized. Now to get that off, you're going to have to tap. We're going to tap again. We're just going to pop this up, and what's going to hold us back is only the pressure of this rusty shaft on the seal. And of course we have a gasket down in here that we'll have to break. Now I'm going to clean that up just a little bit right here. This shaft just so that we can slide off of there easier. Whenever we have to slide over something rusty, it's difficult because the clearance in this side bearing, the clearance between this shaft and the hole in that side housing is only a couple thousandths of an inch. So let's just shine that shaft up a little bit. Shine the old shaft. There we are. And let's find a little bit of our light lubricant. There we are. Let's just squirt that down there just to assist us in getting this off. We're going to tap that housing straight up. That's an easy one. If you're seized up, you may have to tap for 10 minutes with 2 hammers on either side to bring this thing up, but you're going to save your engine if you do, or we'll show you how to save your engine. We'll slide that right off. Remember, as I said, this is your oil pan. We get a little bit of tightness right at the end, and that's because I didn't clean that shaft up maybe quite as well as I should have. Let's turn it around. Be really careful where you tap in here. Now I'm holding that engine up, so I've got all the weight of the engine, but you can see it's just the rustiness on that shaft, and I'm crooked as well. So try to tap that off straight. There it comes. All right, let's look at this thing first. There's your oil pan, and right in here is the little surface that I referred to. There's just a bushing surface where that crankshaft comes through. These 2 little notches here are oil grooves, and we have a little hole, all right, in here that lets oil come in just on a splash system, so this stays lubricated and that oil runs in and out of here, and there's a little groove there just for oiling on that bushing. But as I say, if you run one of these engines out of oil, quite often this will be what's seized and not your rod bearing. Here's where your filler plug comes in, where your oil comes in when you dump it down from the top, comes in through here. This just lays full of oil, and this is a simple splash system. This little fitting right here holds the end of the camshaft, and I'll show you that in a minute. This one for crankshaft, this one for camshaft, and it has a little oil groove in it as well. Let's set that aside. Now we'll get down to the meat and potatoes here, or whatever we want to call it. We have a couple little interesting things in here. Our crankshaft, again, as we mentioned. You can see a little gear here. And we've also got a funny little widget-looking thing right here. All right, we're just going to take that off the camshaft. Now that is gear-driven. Whoa, hold on. That is gear-driven by the camshaft. Now you're saying, Bob, what is that thing? And that is nothing but a little splash oiling mechanism. All right? It runs off the camshaft gear, and as the camshaft goes around, this thing just whirls around in here and splashes oil all over the inside of the crankcase. Let's take it off and set it aside. Camshaft. What is a camshaft? Now the camshaft is the little mechanism that controls your valves, and it shoves these valves, which run right in here, up and down in time with the piston going up and down on the crankshaft. I'm going to pull the camshaft out of there just like that. There's our little engine camshaft. 2 lobes on it. Nothing fancy about it. We've got 2 valves in this engine. It's a 1-cylinder. If you've got a V8 car, you've got 16 lobes. All right? 2 lobes for a 1-cylinder engine, 1 for intake and 1 for exhaust. And there's a timing mark on this, and when we reassemble it, we'll show you how to put that back together properly. You heard something else fall in here. I got to reach into the oil, and I'm just going to show you this. This is a cam follower, and I'm going to set this down for a minute. We've got 2 of them in there. Let's wipe them off, and they look like a little upside down valve. There's one right there. That's a cam follower, and they'll fall in on you, and that's very critical to have that in there, of course, because it's what fills the distance between your camshaft, which sits here and turns, and your valve. This cam follower sits here. When your cam goes up, it goes up, pushes your valve up, and of course you get intake or exhaust. Let's set that aside. Now, I'm going to drain a little bit of this oil out of here, We did not have this perfectly drained. There, I've got that cleaned out a little bit. There's that other cam follower. Now we're going to go into here and disconnect the connecting rod, which is the thing that has the piston on the end of it. But before we do that, we're going to take the head off this engine so we can see how both ends work in relationship to each other. To remove our head on our engine, we have a series here of 1/2-inch bolts. There's nothing fancy about it. Take a 1/2-inch wrench and spin them all off. All right, there's our head coming off. All that little series of bolts. I've left the flange on here that holds the carburetor. It's bolted in with that mechanism. Our head gasket just fell off. This is a good time. Oh, our bolts just fell out. We're falling to pieces here. This is a good time to look at our engine head, and we can get some idea of what kind of a burn we've been having. You can see by all the black and tarry stuff in this that this engine's been burning a lot of oil, and that's probably, we know that already because that's why we're doing this. We're going to tear it down and overhaul it. But this is a little aluminum head secured on there by 7 bolts that caps your compression chamber. Let's set it aside. Let's turn this engine a little bit and show you something. There's the top of your piston, and this is your compression chamber right here. Now what we want to do right now is show you when the crankshaft moves. There's our crankshaft. You can see our piston hooked onto that moving up and down, and as this thing comes up, each stroke, it does one of a couple things. It either takes air in on its way down, an air-gas mixture, which comes through this valve, and I've got this, I haven't got that one loose, comes in through that valve, over that head, is drawn down. The next time it comes up, it compresses that, and the weight of the flywheel brings that back up. It compresses that gas-air mixture. When it gets right to there, which is what we call top dead center, it fires and blows that thing back down. On the next stroke up, our exhaust valve opens like that, and exhaust goes out, and then we start the procedure all over again. Now you can see on the head of this as well, if you've got a good running engine and you happen to be in here for any reason, you'll see white chalky material in here, and that means you're getting a good burn. This engine is getting a good burn, but it's burning mostly oil. Let's look inside our crankcase again. I'm going to set this up so you can get as good a look at it as possible. There's our crankshaft. And what we have to do right now is turn this around so we can see our connecting rod. See it? That's our connecting rod, and the connecting rod connects the crankshaft to the piston. There's only one possible way to get it in this engine, but when you're doing anything with a connecting rod or crankshaft, it's a good idea to mark it as to where you are. And the way mechanics always mark is that you mark both parts of this connecting rod towards the camshaft. All right, you always mark towards the camshaft. This is an aluminum connecting rod. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a little punch mark right there. And that tells me that that's towards the camshaft, and it's on the side that I can see. And on the other part of the connecting rod, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to put a little punch mark, and that tells me it's towards me, towards me and the camshaft. All right, always camshaft side. Now, we have 2 little retainers right in here on those 2 bolts. And we got to use a screwdriver again and tap them open. Now they're the same as the ones we saw in the muffler, except these ones are under oil all the time. So we're just going to take a screwdriver and tap them open. See that? We're tapping that little retainer tang back. I might have to get in your way here, but we got to, whoa, hold on. We got to do that on both of them because we can't get a wrench on them otherwise and can't get them loose. Let me set this up again and squeeze it a little bit. All right, we're going to tap that one back. Now we've got those little keepers tapped open. We have to go in there with a little 7/16" wrench and loosen those off. I'm going to have to get in front of you for a second here to get at this. Oh, I haven't got my keeper back far enough. I haven't got that bottom keeper back far enough. There, it's back far enough now. Inside with a 7/16" combination wrench and loosen off that connecting rod. I'm losing my grip here. I'm losing my grip. All right, and let's take those bolts out. Just backing that one out. Now you may have to jiggle your engine a little bit or turn it over a little bit to get those bolts free. And that's a connecting rod bolt, not to be confused with any other bolt in the engine. All right, they're special bolts, they're extra hard. One more on the top of our connecting rod. So you may have to turn this a little bit to get the best angle for your